was the winter of 2018 when I first realized how silence could become a living, breathing thing. I had recently moved to a small rental house just outside Flagstaff, Arizona, after my divorce. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a creaky front porch, and an overgrown yard, but it was quiet, affordable, and far from the chaos I'd been running from. I just started a remote graphic design job, and my days were filled with coffee, emails, and the comforting rhythm of solitude. Most nights, I didn't mind being alone. The wind outside the pines had a rhythm of its own, and I'd grown used to the occasional creak of settling wood. The house was built in the late 1960s, a small cabin that had been expanded into something resembling a home. The insulation wasn't great, and the floorboards let out faint groans when you walked in certain spots. But there was something oddly peaceful about its imperfection, at least at first. It was a Thursday night, cold and quiet. Snow had started to fall earlier that evening, blanketing the yard in a soft white glow under the porch light. I had just finished a long client meeting and was sipping a late cup of coffee while scrolling through a playlist. The clock on the wall ticked just past midnight when I decided to call it a night. I checked that the front and back doors were locked, turned off the kitchen light, and headed toward my bedroom. My dog, Marley, a golden retriever mix, was already curled up at the foot of the bed, snoring softly. He was a gentle dog, never aggressive, but always alert to sounds. That night, though, he seemed restless. His ears twitched at random intervals, and he kept lifting his head, staring at the door as if expecting something. I tried to ignore it. Dogs sometimes sense things that aren't there, wildlife outside, distant noises. I brushed my teeth, dimmed the lamp, and lay down, pulling the blanket close as the cold seeped through the old window frames. Around 1:17 a.m., Marley started growling, low, deep, and unlike anything I'd heard from him before. I sat up instantly, heart racing. His eyes were fixed on the hallway that led to the kitchen. The house was completely dark except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I held my breath and listened. At first, nothing. Just the faint hum of the heater and the ticking clock. But then came a sound, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. A slow dragging noise from the other side of the house. It was faint, deliberate, like someone moving a chair across the floor. I froze. Marley's growl deepened, his fur bristling. My mind immediately jumped to rational explanations. Maybe something fell. Maybe it was the pipes expanding from the cold. But the sound came again, slower this time, and closer. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and noticed the signal bar flickering. No reception. I tried to laugh it off to myself, but my mouth was too dry for that. I got up, every step careful not to make the floor creak too loudly. I didn't turn on any lights. I wanted to see before being seen. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, the kind of hallway that feels too silent even during the day. I stopped at the end, listening again. The sound had stopped, replaced by a heavier stillness. Then came a soft click, the sound of a door latch moving. From the kitchen, I felt my stomach drop. I knew I'd locked that door before bed. Slowly, I moved closer, gripping the flashlight I kept on the counter. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I hesitated. The air felt colder here, sharper, like the window had been opened. I switched on the light. Everything looked normal, except for the back door. It was open just a few inches, letting in a thin curtain of snow. My pulse hammered, so hard it hurt. I shut the door quickly and locked it again, double-checking the latch. Marley had followed me in, his tail tucked, head low. He wasn't barking now, just staring at something. His gaze was fixed on the small storage closet by the refrigerator. That door had been closed earlier. Now it was slightly open, just a sliver. A faint draft came from inside, carrying with it a scent I'll never forget. Damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. My skin crawled. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the door open. The small bulb above the washer flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Inside, everything looked as it should. Laundry detergent, broom, empty shelves. But in the corner, behind a stack of folded blankets, I saw something that didn't belong. A muddy boot print. Fresh. Still wet. I backed away so fast I hit the counter behind me. The boot print was large, definitely from a man's shoe, and angled toward the door, not away from it. Someone had been standing in there. Recently. Maybe still was. I locked myself and Marley in the bedroom, heart pounding, and tried calling 911 again. No signal. I turned on airplane mode, then off again, hoping to reset it. Still nothing. The snow outside was probably interfering with the tower. Minutes crawled by like hours. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed earlier. Marley's ears perked suddenly, and his head turned toward the vent near the floor. That's when I heard its soft, measured breathing. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Marley's either. It was coming from the vent. For a moment, I felt my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I leaned closer, I could hear it. Faint but distinct. Inhale. Exhale. Slow, steady, human. The vent connected to the crawl space under the house. A space barely 3 feet high, accessible from an outside hatch near the foundation. I realized then that whoever had been in the house wasn't gone. They'd gone underneath it. I stayed still for nearly 20 minutes, too scared to make a sound. Every noise in that house suddenly felt alive. Every gust of wind, every creak, every shift of the walls. Then, a faint scraping sound came from a floor beneath the bed. Marley began to growl again, low and trembling. The scraping moved, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging themselves through dirt and wood. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I tried once more to dial for help. This time, the call went through, but the line was filled with static. I whispered my address, begged for someone to come, and stayed on the line until I heard the dispatcher confirm a unit was on the way. Those next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. The scraping stopped, replaced by the faint, rhythmic thud of movement, someone crawling back toward the vent. I heard a metallic sound, like the hatch outside being pushed open. Then silence. When the police finally arrived, I ran outside barefoot into the snow to meet them. The officers searched the house and the crawl space. The hatch was wide open. Inside, they found a few things that still haunt me. An old sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, a broken flashlight, and a single Polaroid photograph. It showed the inside of my living room, taken from the corner, near the closet. I don't know how long that man had been living beneath my house, or how many nights he'd watched me without my knowing. The police believed he'd broken in weeks earlier, using the crawl space as a hiding spot and sneaking out when I wasn't home. I sold the house a month later. The new owner probably has no idea what happened there. But even now, years later, whenever I hear a vent hum or a floorboard creak beneath me, my heart still skips a beat, because I know what that silence means. I was 28 when I took the job as a seasonal ranger in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It was 2017, late autumn, and the trees were shedding the last of their orange and crimson leaves. The cold air had a damp, earthy smell that seemed to seep into my clothes, and the sound of wind threading through miles of forest made you feel small, like the mountains were alive and breathing all around you. The ranger station where I was assigned was called Pine Hollow Outpost, a small wooden cabin miles from the nearest town. There were only 2 of us stationed there for the winter season, me and an older ranger named Bill Turner. Bill was in his 50s, quiet and steady, the kind of man who had spent more time in the woods than in towns. He told me early on, half jokingly, that out there, you learn to listen more than you talked. The forest has its own language, he'd said, and not everything that speaks wants to be heard. At first, I thought it was just a bit of mountain superstition, but after what I saw, I think about that line almost every night. Our days were simple. Patrol the trails, check for signs of poachers, keep the cabins stocked for hikers, and monitor wildlife activity. The nights were long, bitterly cold, and almost painfully quiet. No traffic noise, no distant hum of towns, just the wind and the creaking of trees. You'd think that kind of silence would be peaceful, but after a while, it starts to feel unnatural. The first odd thing happened about 3 weeks into my post. It was a Sunday, around 4:30 in the morning. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't an animal. I knew the difference between deer, coyotes, bears, even bobcats. This sound was heavier, slow, dragging steps moving outside the cabin on the gravel path. Then a pause, then more movement, circling around. I sat up in my bunk, holding my breath. Bill's bed was empty. He'd taken the ATV into town the night before to get supplies. That meant I was completely alone. I reached for my flashlight and swept the beam toward the window, but the fog outside was so thick it just bounced back in a dull glow. The steps stopped right outside the window nearest my bunk. I could hear gravel shift, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was standing there listening. I didn't move. I just sat frozen, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then the faint sound of breathing, deep, uneven, like a smoker struggling to inhale. It was right outside the wall, no more than a few feet away. I wanted to shout, but my throat locked. After what felt like a full minute, the steps started again, crunching away from the cabin and fading into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. When Bill returned that afternoon, I told him what I'd heard. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, you'll hear things up here. Best not to go looking when you do." Then he went about unloading supplies like it was nothing. That night, I stood outside with a cup of coffee and tried to convince myself it was probably just an elk or maybe even a bear nosing around. But deep down, something about the rhythm of those steps had felt too deliberate. Over the next few weeks, small things began to happen. On morning patrols, I'd find boot prints in the mud near the trails, too large for Bill, too deep for casual hikers, and always alone. Once, I found a dead rabbit hanging from a low branch, its fur neatly stripped from the skull. Another time, I discovered a crude circle of stones in a clearing, each one carved with strange vertical slashes, like tally marks. Bill kept dismissing it all as locals messing around, but I started noticing something strange in him too. At night, he'd keep the lanterns burning low and insist we never leave them completely off. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night and just sit at the window, staring out into the dark for hours without saying a word. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was early December, bitterly cold. The wind was howling hard enough to make the shutters rattle. Around midnight, Bill and I were finishing our log reports when the radio crackled, static, then a faint voice. It was from another ranger post, nearly 15 miles south. The transmission was barely audible through the interference, but we caught enough to make out the words, "Lost hiker," multiple screams, "Need backup." Bill's face went pale. He grabbed his rifle and said we were heading out immediately. I followed him reluctantly, heart pounding, the wind cutting into my face as we rode the ATV down the narrow forest trail. The headlights bounced across the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows. We reached the area around 1:20 a.m. The other post's cabin was dark, its door wide open. Inside, the chairs were overturned, the table splintered, and the lanterns shattered on the floor. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away. Just silence and the faint smell of burnt wood. We radioed for assistance, but the line was dead again. The mountains had a way of swallowing signals whole. That's when we heard it, faint at first, carried by the wind. A scream. It wasn't human in tone. It was too long, too strained, rising in pitch until it broke into something else, something almost animal. We both froze, listening. Then another scream, closer. Bill muttered that we needed to leave immediately, but I couldn't move. Through the trees, about 30 yards away, I saw something move, tall, pale, and impossibly thin. It walked between the trees with jerky, uneven movements, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Each step seemed wrong, too long for human legs, and its head hung low, swaying slightly. I couldn't see its face. I didn't want to. Bill grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the ATV. As we turned to leave, something slammed into the side of the vehicle with such force it almost flipped. I caught a glimpse in the side mirror, a flash of gray skin, an arm too long, fingers clawing at the frame. We sped through the forest, branches whipping across our faces. I didn't look back. When we finally made it to the outpost, we barricaded the door and stayed awake until sunrise. The following morning, we returned with a backup team from the main ranger station. The southern post was empty. No sign of struggle. No bodies. No blood. Nothing. But about a quarter mile from the cabin, they found something that made the chief ranger turn white. On a tree trunk, about 8 feet up, were deep claw marks, 5 of them, spaced far wider than a man's hand could reach. After that incident, Bill requested a transfer and left within the week. I stayed just long enough to finish my term, but every night after I felt it, that same heavy silence pressing down on the cabin walls. Sometimes I'd wake up and swear I heard breathing again outside the window. When I finally left Pine Hollow Outpost for good, I told myself it was all just fatigue and isolation. But even now, years later, when I drive through those mountain roads, I can't bring myself to look too closely at the tree line. Because sometimes, just for a split second, I catch sight of something, a figure standing too still among the pines. Tall, pale, watching, and every part of me remembers the sound of those slow, dragging steps outside the cabin that night. I still remember the smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee that clung to the hallways of Crestview Community Hospital. It was early December of 2013 in upstate Pennsylvania, and the air outside was freezing, the kind of biting cold that seeps into your clothes and makes every breath sting. I was 23 at the time, freshly graduated and newly hired as a night shift nurse assistant. It was my first real job, and I was proud, but also quietly terrified of doing something wrong. The hospital was small and old, sitting on a hill just off a quiet 2-lane road. The building was 3 stories, but only the first 2 were used regularly. The 3rd floor had been closed off for years, though no one really told me why. I only knew that when you took the elevator, the button for floor 3 didn't light up. It was just there, untouched, slightly worn, like an old scar on the panel. My first shift began at 10 p.m. sharp. The day nurse handed me the chart and smiled tiredly before heading out into the cold. The night crew was smaller, just 2 registered nurses, 1 janitor, and me. The hospital's emergency department barely saw any patients after midnight, except the occasional drunk driver or local injury. It was quiet, too quiet, and that made every sound echo far longer than it should have. Around 1 a.m., I finished checking on the few patients we had on the 2nd floor and sat at the nurse's station trying to keep myself awake. The lights flickered every so often, which wasn't uncommon in a building that old, but each time it happened, it made me jump a little. I was reading through a patient's notes when I heard it. A soft creaking sound, almost like someone slowly walking down the hall in rubber soles. The janitor, Mr. Howard, usually cleaned the first floor around this time, so I assumed it was him. But when I leaned out to look, the hallway was completely empty. The light at the far end buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the pale tile floor. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings made noises all the time. Expansion, settling vents. Still, something about that sound lingered in my mind. I tried to brush it off until about 15 minutes later, when the same slow footsteps echoed again. Only this time they seemed closer. I froze. The noise stopped the moment I looked toward it, leaving a hollow silence that felt heavier than before. I checked the clock, 1:46 a.m., and decided to do a quick round to calm my nerves. Room 204, 205, and 206 were all quiet, the patients asleep. When I reached 208, I noticed the door was open wider than it had been earlier. I remembered closing it after checking on Mrs. Lawson, a sweet older woman recovering from surgery. I peered inside. She was still asleep, heart monitor beeping softly beside her. But something about the room felt wrong, colder somehow, as if someone had left a window open. The hospital windows couldn't open more than a few inches for safety, so that didn't make sense. I reached for the thermostat on the wall, and just as I did, I heard a faint knock coming from above. Not on the wall above. 3 distinct knocks from the ceiling. I looked up, heart pounding, but saw only the white panels and fluorescent light humming quietly. When I mentioned it to one of the nurses, she brushed it off. Probably pipes or raccoons in the roof, she said, not even looking up from her chart. But I noticed something odd in her tone, a brief hesitation, like she didn't fully believe what she was saying. At 3:12 a.m., the hospital was dead quiet again. I sat at the desk, staring at the security monitor that cycled through black and white feeds of empty corridors. On the camera for the second floor, something flickered, a brief blur of motion in the hallway outside room 210. I blinked, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks. Then it appeared again, a faint shape, like a person standing just out of the light. I leaned closer to the monitor. The figure was barely visible, more like a shadow than a person. It didn't move, didn't shift or sway like a living body would, just stood there motionless. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward that hallway, telling myself the camera was probably glitching. The corridor was empty when I arrived, yet the air felt charged, like static before a storm. My flashlight flickered as I moved toward room 210. The door was half open, and as I approached, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. A faint outline of wet footprints on the linoleum floor leading from the direction of the stairwell. Bare feet. Every instinct told me to go back, but I forced myself forward. The footprints stopped right at the door to 210. Inside, the patient, a middle-aged man recovering from pneumonia, was sleeping soundly. I checked his chart, his 4, everything normal. But when I turned to leave, I felt a sudden drop in temperature so sharp it made my breath fog. The lights dimmed slightly, and I heard that same slow creaking sound again, only this time it was right behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight down the hall, but no one was there. The air felt thick, heavy. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Just a flicker, something dark slipping across the floor toward the stairwell. I followed, half terrified, half hypnotized by the need to know. When I reached the stairwell door, it was slightly ajar, though it should have been locked after midnight. I pushed it open and felt a rush of cold air. The stairwell lights were dim, flickering sporadically. My footsteps echoed as I descended one flight, then stopped. That's when I heard breathing, slow, shallow, coming from just below me. I froze, gripping the railing. The sound didn't move closer, It just stayed there, steady, like someone waiting in the dark. I backed away, heart hammering, and ran up the stairs instead. When I reached the top, I nearly collided with Mr. Howard, the janitor. He looked pale and startled. I asked if he'd been downstairs, but he shook his head slowly and said he'd been mopping the main lobby. Then he muttered something that made my stomach drop. "You shouldn't be near that stairwell after midnight," he said quietly. "It connects to the old third floor." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When my shift ended at sunrise, I walked out into the cold morning air and felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But it didn't last. When I came back for my second shift the next night, I noticed something new. On the security monitor, taped to the side with yellowing Scotch tape, was a small photograph, black and white, old, slightly faded. It showed a group of nurses standing in the same hallway I'd patrolled, all smiling for the camera. And standing behind them, just barely visible near the stairwell door, was a shadowed figure, tall, head slightly tilted, face impossible to make out. The back of the photo had a date written in pencil: August 12th, 1981, third floor reassignment team. That was the year the third floor had been permanently closed after a fire. I never asked what really happened up there. I didn't want to know. After that week, I switched to day shifts. I couldn't bear another night alone in that building. But every now and then, when I drive past Crestview Hospital on my way home, I see the faint light flickering in one of the top floor windows, a floor that hasn't been used for over 30 years.